Hello, church. Good to be with you again. I want to take us on a journey this evening, if you would. I want to take you back in time to a particular day, and I want to introduce you to a very important person. The day I want to take you back to, 1991 years ago, is not Good Friday, not Easter Sunday, but the day that sits in the middle. Passover was always celebrated on the 15th day of Nisan, and this year that translates to between March the 27th and the 3rd of April. So we're right bang in the middle of Passover time now. But as I say, I want to take you back to that Passover Sabbath, the day that lies between Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday. Let me just talk a little bit about Passover first so you understand. Passover was the celebration of freedom from Egypt. It was the fateful night when the angel of death passed over all the houses through the land. And only those houses where the blood of a sacrificed lamb was painted on the doorposts, only those houses survived. Death visited every other house. Now, to be a Jew meant that you had to celebrate Passover. You had to. If you refused to celebrate Passover, you were excommunicated and no longer a Jew. That's really important to understand. And so what it meant at that time of Jesus was that there was probably about 2.5 million people planning to be in Jerusalem for that celebration. You can imagine the problems that presented to the leaders and the rulers of the country. There was all sorts of things had to be done, and there was all sorts of rituals to be obeyed when you celebrated Passover. For example, you had to eat it with your outdoor clothes on. You weren't allowed to eat bread, ordinary bread. You had to eat bread without yeast in it, because it was said that you had to be ready to go. That's why you had your clothes on at any given moment. As soon as God said, go, you're free, you had to be able to run and get out. And it was said that the bread, you couldn't even wait for the bread to rise. So there was no yeast allowed in the house, and you had to have only unleavened bread. And so try and get with me this picture of what's going on. Everybody's on the move. Everybody wants to head to Jerusalem. Everybody within 15 miles had to go to Jerusalem within 15 miles. But outside of that, we know that most of the people from all over the country went. Can you remember the story of Jesus when he's 12? He's with his mum and dad. He goes to the temple with them. It says they went every year. On the way back, they don't realise he's missing because they presumed he's part of the larger caravan, if you like, of people that was travelling down backwards and forwards. So it was normal for people to go and visit Israel. A month before it all started, all the holes were filled in on the ground. The path is made way on the King's Highway. The tombs have been whitewashed so that no stranger might lean against a wall and suddenly become defiled. Everything is happening. When you get there into Jerusalem, you celebrated Passover in groups of 10, some more, some less, but around then, and a lamb had to be eaten, and every part of it had to be eaten. That was really important. And we can read, of course, about what happened with Jesus' celebration at that Last Supper. Just think about it, though. If there was a lamb for every 10 people, and there's 2.5 million people, there would have been around about 250,000 lambs to be sacrificed on that one weekend. Every herd had been tithed, from 8-day-old to 1-year-old lambs. They were tithed. The newborn lambs from the temple flocks had been brought in. The high priest had a fund to help the poor, because everybody not only had to have lamb, but they also had to drink 4 cups of blessing around the meal, and the poor mightn't be able to afford wine, so there was a special fund for the poor for them to be able to access it so they could join in the celebrations. Of course, every priest in the whole of the land was on duty, so there'd be over 20,000 of them on duty in the temple, and then the sacrifices takes place. That 250,000 lambs, it's a horrible thought maybe for our sensibilities, but the blood of all those lambs would have flowed out of the temple drainage system and into Brook Kidron that ran from the side of the temple down past the walls of the city and past the Mount of Olives. And there was a bridge over Brook Kidron that we know Jesus walked over on his way to Gethsemane, and that would have flown red with the blood of all of the lambs. Then there was also the sacrifice that would take place on the day leading to the Sabbath, and other things, other important things that had to take place then as well. The day that Jesus died, the day before the Sabbath that we're talking about, the priests and members of the Sanhedrin would have walked over that bloody river Kidron to a field owned by the temple. It was the act that started the 50 days of countdown that led them to the later Feast of Harvests of Pentecost. And this was the symbolic offering of a sheaf of the first of the harvest, of the promise of that was later to come, that they celebrated later on at Pentecost. And so they would walk into the field in the dark, and it was already prepared for them, and there would be a sheaf of corn bound together, the very first of the corn to be grown. And then they would stand, and the high priest would have a have a sickle, ready to cut the sheaf of wheat. And they would recite certain things, and the first thing that they would chant is, "Has the sun gone down?" And they would all nod to the affirmative. With this sickle into this basket, and then they would cut this sheaf. This sheaf was then put aside for 2 days for a very important ceremony that was going to happen later on. Now this year, and this important man I want to talk about is Joseph Caiaphas. He is the high priest. And of course his problems are vast, because of not only the usual problems, but also other things have been happening. And his big job, his big purpose was primarily to keep the Romans happy and to keep the revolutionaries suppressed. And of course that was his problem, because there was a man had come along called Jesus, son of Joseph of Nazareth. Now Caiaphas is the son-in-law of a man called Annas, and it's worth remembering how this family came to be high priests. Just after the birth of Jesus, King Herod died, and Herod's son Archelaus came to the throne. Now just before Herod died, two rabbis really got their students to rebel and go to the temple and tear down from the temple gate 2 Roman legionary standards. They thought Herod was dead, but he was still alive. But nearly in his final act, what he did was command that these rabbis would be burned at the stake along with their students. Now this really was a huge event and triggered all sorts of really important things. And so what happens is Herod dies. It's virtually the last act he has. And Archelaus comes to the throne. Now, this meant trouble. If you remember, Jesus and Joseph and Mary fled for a few weeks to Egypt when this happened. Herod didn't last long after the massacre of the innocents. But Archelaus, when he came to the throne, had visitors from the Jewish representatives, and they all said, "You must punish the people that your father sent in to kill the rabbis." And they leaned on him to the point where he said yes, but then they continued to despise him. And so he got really, really angry. And what happened then was that he sent in troops into the temple, and he slaughtered 3,000 of the protesters. And he cancelled Passover. Now, I've tried to tell you how big a deal that was. The nation went berserk. There was an uprising. And this was the trigger for the Romans to come into the land. And so what we find is the first thing the Romans do is to put into post as high priests people that they can trust. And the man they gave the job to was Annas. And he was the high priest that served. And then after him, each of his 5 sons continued to serve as high priests. Until eventually we get to the time of Jesus and we find Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas, his son-in-law, has become high priest. Okay. This might explain why you read in John 18 how it says the Roman officer and his men, together with the temple police, arrested Jesus and tied him up and took him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. So what happened was simply that Annas had kept control and Caiaphas was more or less his puppet. He had power, but he wanted and agreed with his father-in-law, Annas, on how things should be done. And Jesus is hauled off to Annas before he's hauled off anywhere else. That's really interesting. Caiaphas was that member of the Sanhedrin that when they were discussing what to do about Jesus, he said this. And again, this is from John chapter 11. One of the council members was Caiaphas, who was also high priest that year. And he spoke up and said, "You people don't have any sense at all. Don't you know that it's better for one man to die for all the people than for the whole nation to be destroyed?" In other words, Caiaphas knew that Jesus was innocent, but thought it safer for Jesus to die than risk revolution on a large scale. This is the man who was in the temple field and had cut that sheaf of wheat. I'm going to bring that together in a second. But if you want the reference for why they did this, I can point you to Leviticus 23, verse 9. And this is after the Passover part of the celebration that we know about. It says, "The Lord told Moses to say to the community of Israel, after you enter the land I give you, the first bundle of wheat from each crop must be given to me. So bring it to a priest on the day after the Sabbath, and he will lift it up in dedication to me, and I will accept you." So Caiaphas has got all the normal problems that's taken place, but he's conscious of the fact that Jesus has been proclaimed king. Hosanna to the King of David, the Son of David. So on Palm Sunday, just a week before this, Jesus had come in and the people had proclaimed him king. This was the most incendiary moment that was possible. Of course, Caiaphas was terrified. This troublemaker Jesus 3 years ago had overturned the tables of the money changers. They belonged to Annas. He had the business that ran inside the temple. This Jesus also disrupted other feasts. This Jesus also challenged every school of expert rabbis. The troublemaker was of the royal line of David, and that was trouble in itself. And then he committed signs and wonders. But these were signs and wonders that broke the law of the Sabbath. And a man who mixed with the worst type of sinners. Even more so, he came from Nazareth, just a short distance away from where an earlier rebellion against Archelaus had taken place. Caiaphas' worst fears had come true with the arrival of Jesus. And it was the last straw. The tables of the money changers were turned again. Jesus kept Passover in an upper room, but fortunately one member of the group was prepared to betray him. But any temptation by Caiaphas to smile that his plans had gone right faltered, because strange things happened that day. On this day, you must remember that the Sabbath starts with sundown. So, not when it's completely dark, but when the sun dips below the horizon, the last rays dip below the horizon, that is the start of a new day. And on the Friday, at 3 o'clock, the sacrificial lamb, not the atonement lamb, but the lamb of Passover, was due to be killed at 3 o'clock in bright sunshine. But at 3 o'clock, just as Jesus was dying upon the cross, darkness fell over the whole of the land. And they had to do the sacrifice in the dark. And then there was an earthquake. Graveyards were opened. There must have been a lot of damage. And the biggest damage was the lintel over the holiest of holies, or rather the holy place, broke. And the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom. He couldn't send anybody in because the Sabbath happened shortly afterwards. The dark meant that they couldn't tell when the exact moment of Sabbath took place. And so he was trapped. He, as he's walking around on this Sabbath day, knows that there's a huge amount of work to be done, but he can't start any of it. Maybe his mind went back to the sheaf of corn that he reaped in the field yesterday. Maybe he thought of that in particular because he must have been shocked that as they walked over Brook Kidron to the field to do this harvesting, 2 leading members of the Sanhedrin weren't there. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus weren't part of the group that did what was required in the dark. Why? Because they were busy asking Pilate for the body of Jesus. And they did that rather than the body be tipped by the Romans into the pits of Gehenna, the rubbish heap outside the city. I'm sure Caiaphas thought again and was glad that he'd put guards upon the tomb, or rather the Romans had put guards on the tomb. I'm sure he's worried about what was happening at the temple. It was a very challenging time. Yeah, indeed. But there are other people too on that day, and I think it's good for us perhaps just to think about them for a moment. Let's go to Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea and the job that they undertook. You know, the Romans wouldn't have taken the body down from the cross as a favour. The body would have been left there. It would have been the Jewish guards that would have taken the body and chucked it into the rubbish heap. But Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus have asked for permission to do that. And so they would have had to take the body down, maybe pulling the nails out of the hands and the feet. Touching a dead body meant that they became ritually unclean. They couldn't take part in any service or any function of ritual of the temple. But of course, perhaps they understood more than the others that they were taking part in something far more important, the fulfillment of ritual, rather than the ritual itself. The prophetic truth that lay at the heart of ritual, because that came alive in history this very day. The lambs that had been slaughtered in their thousands and thousands and probably millions were a shadow of what was really to happen that day. And as they took Jesus down from the cross and became unclean, I'm sure they wept, taking the nails from his hands and feet, taking the crown of thorns off and thrown it aside, wrapping the body in aloes and in bandages. There are other sights to see as well in Jerusalem that day. Somewhere a body hangs from a rope in the potter's field, but nobody can do anything about it because it's the Sabbath. The rope breaks at some point, and the body falls and bursts apart on the field below. A released murderer and revolutionary thinks again about being free. A man from Cyrene by the name of Simon may have ached from carrying another man's cross. and maybe even had to pick spelks out of his hand. A once blind Bartimaeus sees the faces of those people who are telling them the news from Jerusalem. One soldier, lucky at dice, walking around maybe in another man's clothes, or there again, walking around with money in his pocket after selling them. A centurion somewhere stops and thinks about his new conviction that he's just helped crucify the Son of God. Temple guards in a discussion about whether they need to worry about the followers of Jesus. Will they pick up swords again? One man called Malchus, with bloodstains on his tunic, looking into a bronze mirror at an ear that once had been cut but now is perfectly healed and restored. Moved towards the centre of the Roman administration and would find Pilate, maybe arguing with his wife and trying to explain his actions. You see, he didn't flog and beat Jesus out of sadism, although you might think that that is the case. If you read it carefully, you will see that Mark tells us that he had Jesus dressed in purple and a crown of thorns on his head and beaten and flogged to stand there in front of the people as he said, "Look, behold your king. He's been punished. I've done this to him. Now surely you can let him go." But the crowds just cry, "Nail him, nail him." And then say the words that dooms him. "If you're a friend of Caesar, you will not let him live." So for all of Pilate's wife's worries and fears, Pilate does what he has to do. We might find Peter somewhere refusing to speak to anybody, ashamed of his denial. We might find John Mark thinking about his panic and running away and leaving his nightgown behind. The brothers of Jesus are most likely listening to James as he tells them that Jesus should have listened to him, and how he told Jesus that he was doomed and things like this would happen. Maybe Salome thinks of her two sons and how all the arguments about sitting at the right hand and the left hand of God have come to nothing. Mary Magdalene, I'm sure, was crying inconsolably. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, shocked that all the things she thought was going to happen haven't come to pass. And there, again, now in the temple, harvested from that temple field, lies a sheaf of wheat. And it's waiting. They're all now waiting for sunrise, for the sheaf to be presented to God. And then the morning comes. Caiaphas and the other priests wait in the darkness for the first light to break. As it shines its first ray, he shakes the sheaf up high before heaven in a ceremony thousands of years old. The first of the harvest has come. He's right. The first of the harvest has come. The grave clothes fall away. Feet stand on the floor of the tomb. The large and heavy stone is rolled away. Guards faint with fear. The temple veil won't be needed again. Despair is about to turn to joy. Fears are about to be banished. And the high priest holds up the sheaf to present the bread of life to heaven as a symbol of the first fruits. But Jesus has risen from the tomb, and the symbolic again becomes real, and prophecy is fulfilled as the real bread of heaven is held up before a rejoicing heaven. The real bread of life is held up before rejoicing heaven. Whether angels had or not cried at the death of Jesus, I am certain there is the loudest outpouring of praise in all of the heavenly realm. He is risen. Amen.